Jimmy Dean was killed. Jimmy Dean. I think Jimmy Dean was killed. They took out Jimmy Dean. They killed him. He was worth too much money. Jimmy Dean. Jimmy Dean didn't have nothing to do with Jimmy Dean Delight. Jimmy Dean sold Jimmy Dean sausage, the 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 Sara Lee company in the 1980s, and they kept Jimmy Dean as a spokesperson of the Jimmy Dean sausage. They kept him as a spokesperson until about 2004. Next thing you know, they took Jimmy Dean off the spokesperson. And I forgot to say, when Jimmy Dean sold his company in the 80s, and they decided to keep him on as the spokesperson, they moved him out of all managing operations, Jimmy Dean. And they had him as a spokesperson of Jimmy Dean Sausage. So Jimmy Dean stopped managing it and all that jazz. And he sold it over, the company over to Sara Lee. And then he just had some shares in the company. Next thing you know, Jimmy Dean, in 2004, they kicked him off for being a spokesperson of Jimmy Dean Sausage. Jimmy Dean said they did it because he was too old. Jimmy Dean! Jimmy Dean, they say he did it because he was too old. And Jimmy Dean was hanging out with George Bush. Jimmy Dean. Jimmy Dean had a yacht named the Big Bad John. And Jimmy Dean had George Bush on the Big Bad John on numerous occasions. Jimmy Dean. So when you see Jimmy Dean had shares in the Jimmy Dean company. He didn't own the whole company. He sold the company to the Sara Lee company, and they started managing Jimmy Dean. So when you see Jimmy Dean, Delight, all that stuff, that was somebody else. It's just Jimmy Dean's name. Jimmy Dean. So Jimmy Dean made his money and he had his estate, Jimmy Dean. I think they killed Jimmy Dean. In 2009, Jimmy Dean's estate went on fire and the Deans didn't get hurt. And next thing you know, Jimmy Dean was sitting down watching some television. He was eating, watching some television. His wife went in another room. Next thing you know, Jimmy Dean was unresponsive, and Jimmy Dean was pronounced dead after 7 o'clock in 2010. I think it was June when he died. Jimmy Dean, but I think they killed Jimmy Dean. Jimmy Dean's wife went back and married her sweetheart, her high school sweetheart, 2 years later after Jimmy Dean died. Jimmy Dean, Jimmy Dean's wife, she went and married her high school sweetheart 2 years after Jimmy Dean died. Jimmy Dean. And a year before Jimmy Dean died, his house was caught on fire, but Jimmy Dean wasn't in that fire. I think they went and took Jimmy Dean out. They took Jimmy Dean off the spokesperson of Jimmy Dean. They said he was too old. Jimmy Dean, too old. Jimmy Dean. So, motherfucker, but Jimmy Dean was hanging out with those Bushes. I don't know about that Jimmy Dean.